Tier lists have practically been run into the ground in the Skyblock community, with new ones coming out nearly every day. I can't be too critical though, cause even I have done my fair share of tier lists. Hold up. Is that 70k views on a 40-minute video? Okay guys, for no reason at all, I'm going to be doing a tier list on every single weapon in Hypixel Skyblock. But to actually make it sorta unique, I decided to ask you guys and a bunch of pros to see how your opinions on the weapons might differ. But before we jump into it, if you want to ruin my island, subscribe, because I'm placing 5 diamond blocks for every single subscriber I get from this video. If you want to support me even more, make sure to use code MASH in the Hypixel store or buy my Baby Yeti cosmetic from the Essentials store. And now, let's jump right into it. Okay, first we need to lay out the rules of the tier list. I decided to keep it pretty simple and only give one criteria to use for ranking, which was usefulness for price. This means even if a weapon is cheap, it can still be ranked high if it's really useful for its price. An obvious example of this would be something like an AOTV, which isn't really that expensive but provides so much mobility, making it a no-brainer for anybody to get for such a low price, and that will put it in S tier. On the other hand, a weapon like the mosquito bow is pretty good, but for the price it's terrible, as you could easily get way more value out of a juju bow and for considerably cheaper, which would make it a way lower tier. Okay, now that we've got the criteria out of the way, let's get into the tier list. So I've got 2 tier lists as I said earlier. The first one's made by pros, which I individually asked from my guild to make. I got each of them to make their own tier list, and using a website I was able to take each of their tier lists and combine it into one aggregate tier list, which basically evens out all the different results from all the different tier lists. For the second tier list, I made a community post and Discord announcement asking you guys to rank all the weapons in the game. I know the title says pro vs noob, but pro versus average or normal player doesn't really sound as cool, but I still think it's pretty interesting. Of course, I use the same aggregate website to do these tier lists as well, so that all of the data gets basically put into one tier list. Before we get into the differences of each tier list, let's first get a baseline by going through the tier list you guys created. Starting at the bottom, the lowest weapon ranked by far was the undead bow. After the undead bow, it went Spider Sword, Fancy Sword, Alchemist Staff, Starlight Wand, Slime Bow, Wither Bow, Super Undead Bow, Squire Sword. Luckily the F tier was the longest, so now we don't have to go through that big of a tier. So next we're going on to the D tier, which is just one step higher, and the lowest in the D tier was Explosive Bow, followed by the Boomerang, Necron's Blade, Artisanal Short Bow, Pigment Sword, Edible Mace, Runin's Bow, Conjuring, Pooch Sword, Soul's Rebound, Voidwalker Katana, Venom's Touch, and finally Flower of Truth. Then going up again another tier to the C tier, the worst in the C tier was the Sinseeker Scythe. Next was the Dragon Short Bow, Rogue Sword, Raider's Axe, Spirit Bow, Revenant Falchion, Twilight Dagger, Hurricane Bow, Jerry Shingun, Tribal Sphere, Fire Dust Dagger, Ink Wand, Fire Free Staff, Undead Sword, and then finally Zombie Sword. Now moving on to B tier, we actually get to the pretty decent items that you can probably use. So the best on the B tier was the Reaper Falchion. After that was the Frozen Scythe, Kindle Blade Dagger, Aspect of the Dragons, Soul Whip, Yeti Sword, Maw Edge Dagger, Reaper Scythe, Dreadlord Sword, Sword of Bad Health, Fire Fury Staff, Bonzo Staff, Necromancer Sword, and finally Void Edge Katana. Now onto the pretty good items. So now we're on to the A tier, which is the second best. And in the A tier, we have Spirit Scepter, then Giant Sword, Juju Short Bow, Shadow Fury, Glacial Scythe, Aurora Staff, Sidecross Dagger, Livid Dagger, Ornate Zombie Sword, Midas Staff, Last Breath, Vorpal Katana, Ragnarok Axe. Now onto the S tier, which is the best items in the game. And starting with the worst of this would be the Death Ripper Dagger, followed by the Withercloak Sword, Florida Zombie Sword, Adam's Spit Katana, Ice Spray Wand, Axe of the Shredded, Valkyrie, Aspect of the End, Astrea, Daedalus Axe, Scylla, Dark Claymore, Aspect of the Void, Hyperion, and finally Terminator. Okay, now that we're done with that and you know the contents of the first tier list, let's actually look at the differences between this one and the tier list made by the pros. I'm not going to go over all the stuff from the pro tier list because you're probably already bored of me listing the other ones and you may have skipped it, which I don't blame you. So let's just go into the differences itself. Generally, both tier lists are pretty similar to each other, but each of them still have plenty of little differences. So I picked out some of the ones I found the most interesting. On the normal tier list, Gemstone Gauntlet was actually put at a D tier, but on the pros list, it was at the complete opposite, at the Gemstone Gauntlet being in the S tier. I asked one of the pros why they put it there, and they said, for its price, it's an insanely overpowered mining tool. It's only outclassed by 2 or 3 other drills, which are 3 times the price or more. And after listening to this, I do agree. It's really cheap and pretty easy requirements to use. You can use it for a pretty long time before you really need to upgrade. That's basically what I did when I first started mining and was trying to get Hottom 7. So I just used it for a pretty long time, and because I haven't done too much mining, it's basically the pick I've only ever used in this game. The next weird difference I found was the Fire Free Staff, which for normal players was comfortably put in the C tier, but for the pros it was actually put around in the A tier. And I asked one of the pros why they did this, and this is what they said. Fire Free Staff is really good for certain things. Mostly though, it's more endgame content and just makes stuff easier. Like it can be used to freeze an Inquisitor in place while doing Diana, and it's used as a staple item in the M3 boss fight for the first phase, since it locks onto Professor in place so you can unload arrows into him and not have to worry about knockback. Since most players aren't endgame, this actually explains why it was ranked so low, because in their perspective there isn't really any use for it. But for good players, it's actually pretty good as a QOL item, as they can use it to make fighting some enemies pretty easy. Unlike the other items I listed, which were basically underrated, the Ornate zombie sword was actually overrated by normal players, as they put it comfortably in A tier, while the pros had it down in C tier. One of the pros who put it in C tier said they only really did it because, well, like I said, my reasoning is because it's only realistically used for tanking, and comparing something of a small amount of use cases to major weapons like Hype and Turn pushes it decently down in comparison. This actually makes a lot of sense for why pros might not have it that high up, considering it isn't really good enough for them to actually use at any cost, especially when a Hype is probably going to out-heal it pretty easily. Finally, the last major difference I wanted to point out was the Midas sword. It was ranked in the B tier by the pros, but the F tier by the normal players. You'd think it would be the other way around, but it wasn't. So I decided to ask one of the players who put it in B tier, and he said, it's a pretty sword. So that's a valid reason, and we can end this video. See ya guys in the next one. Later! Okay, now for the actual reason he said it. Other than it being a pretty sword, it's actually pretty easy to get one at a decent price from the AH or just from buying it off of other people. And this is actually pretty much true. If you go onto any Discord that has like a selling channel, you can usually find people selling Midases for pretty cheap, especially lower than they actually paid for it, because people don't really like Midases. So the only way that they're actually going to sell it is if they sell it at a fair price. So if you are looking for a weapon and don't mind going and looking for people to buy from, you might actually consider getting a Midas. It's not that bad of a choice. Yeah, but that's basically it for this video. If you enjoyed this new versus pro type of style video, please let me know, and maybe I'll do it with other items or just other stuff in general. And yeah, that's basically it. I'm sorry that I haven't uploaded in a while, but I'll see you guys in another video soon. Later.